Welcome to This Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today because we're unpacking something that affects literally every single one of us every single day. We're looking at the actual architecture of power. And the absolute core concept you need to understand right off the bat is that power in our society isn't just random. It doesn't just happen by accident. It's meticulously designed through the laws that shape our daily lives. Laws define exactly what's allowed, what's restricted, and ultimately what gets rewarded in our world.
So who really writes our laws? We kind of hold on to this highly idealized vision of democracy, right? We picture passionate public debate right there on the parliament floors, lawmakers arguing at podiums, representing the direct voice of the people, and then boom, a law is born. But the reality is actually far more complex and honestly, a lot more fascinating. The truth is, laws are shaped in private rooms long before the public ever even gets a glimpse of them. The unseen foundation of global policy is actually built on strategic meetings, massive deep dive research papers, and very quiet, behind closed doors discussions. Long before a bill is ever announced on the evening news or debated on a public stage, its entire framework is being actively constructed by the people who are deeply invested in how it turns out. All right, let's dive into Section 1, the hidden policy process and defining the mechanism. Okay, to truly understand this hidden power, we have to look closely at the mechanism of lobbying itself. It's the fully legal, democratic tool where organizations present their interests directly to decision makers. And in theory, it's completely fair. If a policy is going to affect you, well, you should have a voice in shaping it, right? But here is a central tension we need to talk about. While the mechanism is theoretically available to absolutely everyone, the actual influence is definitely not evenly distributed.
Just look at the timeline of a typical policy. This proves that early-stage drafting is where the real game is played. Notice that massive gap between month 3, the early draft, and month 12, the final public vote. As the public, we tend to focus all our outrage and attention on months 12. But the really crucial language, the specific exemptions, those precise little loopholes, those are actually quietly inserted way back in month 3. Which brings us to an absolute fundamental truth of power. Influence at the beginning matters infinitely more than influence at the end. Literally, by the time a bill reaches the televised debate stage, its core structure is totally set in stone. The people and organizations who are actually in the room helping to write the rules in the first place, they're the ones who ultimately shape the outcomes. If you're only trying to influence a policy when it's up for a final vote, you're already months or sometimes even years too late.
Moving right along to Section 2, the American lobbying machine and structured power. So in the United States, this whole dynamic builds into a highly organized, heavily capitalized institution of its own. Major corporate entities and massive trade groups, we're talking players like the American Petroleum Institute, Amazon, Pfizer, they invest massive amounts of capital into this process. The sheer scale of it is staggering. They don't just sit around and wait for laws to happen to them. They actively engage through campaign financing and aggressive advocacy to ensure their interests stay front and center in Washington. Now, how is the system actually viewed? Well, supporters argue this structured system is absolutely vital. They say it ensures that diverse industries have professional representation and that lawmakers actually understand the incredibly complex economic impacts of their decisions. Critics, on the flip side, hit back pointing out that it disproportionately amplifies the voices of those with the deepest pockets. The undeniable takeaway here is that access shapes influence. And fairness, well, fairness is entirely in the eye of whoever has the resources to play the game. Let's cross the pond for Section 3, the European Balancing Act, looking at regulation and negotiation. Across the Atlantic, we see a totally stark contrast. While the U.S. model is heavily driven by capital and direct campaign financing, the European Union utilizes more of a regulatory, multi-stakeholder model. It's overseen by the European Commission, and the whole process in Brussels is deliberately slower. It's way more negotiation-heavy. The stated goal there isn't just amplified advocacy for the highest bidder, but rather balanced stakeholder input. They're basically forcing governments, corporate interests, and civil society groups to all sit down at the exact same table. And that leads to the ultimate U challenge. How do you encourage participation while limiting disproportionate influence? It's a constant, incredibly delicate balancing act. They want absolutely everyone to have a voice, sure, but they are constantly battling to make sure a massive multinational corporation doesn't just completely drown out a tiny environmental organization during those endless, drawn-out negotiations. All right, Section 4, State and External Influence, exploring alternative global models. So, the desire for influence is absolutely universal. But the mechanisms themselves completely transform depending on the government structure you're looking at. Take China, for example. You are definitely not going to find a massive public lobbying industry there like you'd see in Washington or Brussels. Instead, policy and corporate strategy kind of evolve together through internal state-aligned planning. Massive entities like Huawei and Alibaba, they don't lobby from the outside. Their strategies are deeply intertwined with national priorities through totally internal consultations with the state, which really brings up a fascinating reality. Influence does not disappear without lobbying. It just changes form. Just because there are zero Western-style lobbying firms on the streets of Beijing doesn't mean corporate influence is somehow absent. The power dynamics are still very actively shaping policy. They're just being channeled through a completely different structural mechanism. And that mechanism changes yet again when we zoom in on the African model. Here, policy isn't just some internal negotiation between a state and its local corporations. It is heavily swayed by massive external partners. We're talking entities like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and multinational corporations like Shell playing a totally monumental role. These external entities very often dictate terms through development financing, strict debt structuring, and absolutely massive resource extraction agreements. So this creates a highly complex, really tough reality for African governments. They are essentially forced into a difficult position where creating laws means constantly balancing desperate national development needs against some seriously intense external pressures. Their policy decisions have to reflect not just what their own citizens need, but what global financial markets and massive foreign investors are demanding from them. Finally, Section 5. When influence becomes law. Let's do a reality check. Let's zoom back out from all these huge global power structures to your actual daily life, because here is the core reality. Once influence is written into law, it just becomes normalized. Those private meetings, those wildly complex negotiations, once the ink is actually dry, they literally become the invisible architecture of our world. They define our financial markets, they dictate our job security, and they directly affect the everyday prices of the goods we buy at the store. We stop seeing the influence entirely, and we just kind of accept it as the way things are. To summarize the actual mechanics of it all, it basically operates in a simple three-step pipeline. Step 1, connecting interests. Step 2, leveraging institutions. Step 3, dictating outcomes. Remember, lobbying doesn't just magically create power out of thin air. It takes existing interests, which, let's be real, are usually backed by capital, and it channels them through government institutions to create completely binding outcomes. It is a deliberate, meticulously designed pipeline from desire straight into law. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly vital question to ponder. As you go about your week interacting with the rules, the regulations, and the markets all around you, just ask yourself, so when laws shape our lives, whose influence are they really reflecting? Because understanding that power is deliberately designed is the absolute first step to truly understanding the world we live in. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparked your curiosity to look a little bit closer at the rules we all live by every single day.